Well, good morning, Trinity friends, and welcome back to Envisioning the Early Christian Church through its art, our Christian formation series for this season. We're so grateful that you're with us this morning as you join us on Zoom. Just so you know that these formation videos can be viewed at any time, even though we're releasing it on Sunday morning at 9:30. You can watch it throughout the week, so you can have these on demand. Just use the same link that got you here. So last couple of weeks, we've been starting in the early times of art, both for human history and for Christianity. And this week with Jennine Hough, our Trinitarian art historian, we're moving into a new period and a new phase of art in the Christian church. So Jennine, welcome. Thank you for being with us. I hope you're doing well today. And we're so excited about what you have in store for us today.
Well, thank you, David. I want to do just a little bit of a review of last week. We saw some second and third, mostly second and third, a little bit of early 4th century Christian art. And two of our main sites, our first site was at Dura Europos, and we saw a Jewish synagogue with amazing paintings, 4 registers of history of the Jewish faith, really, from the book of Exodus and Numbers. And we also saw at the same site a house church, and particularly we were looking at the baptistry in the church and how the church was the house was converted into a place of worship for early Christians. And there was some distinction between the two. The Jewish images were so much more complete and vibrant and solid than the Christian. And the reason for this, of course, is because, first of all, we learned that that there was art in the Jewish world. And they were not afraid of the human figure, although the human figure was shown flat, small. It wasn't sculpture, and it wasn't an idol, which was the big restriction. And when we looked at the Christian paintings, they were looser, sketchier, done quicker. And, you know, the Jews occupied the Middle East before the Romans did. So the Romans tolerated the Jewish faith for the most part until there was a rebellion. And the Christian faith was considered mysterious and from the East, and it became, particularly with Christ and early after Christ, something they were trying to stomp out or resist. So you have, those two different aspects to the early art in Dura Europos. And then we looked at mainly 3 catacombs of early Christian art. And this was, again, symbolic. The subject matter, for the most part, was concerning salvation. We had this, prefiguration is one of the terms used for it, where older stories, biblical stories, even myths, are read in the Christian world to be about Christ. And we saw that in the shepherd. Christ is the shepherd with the sheep, a young man. And we saw the stories of Jonah and also Noah and also Daniel, all who died or were sent to the underground, to the belly of the whale, or in this case, the dragon, and were reborn, so to speak, or resurrected. So this was a story the early Christians knew how to read. And the very last image I showed you was of Christ after Constantine legalized the Christian religion, and that would have been in 331 with the Council of Milan.
And it was such a drastic difference. I mean, you could really see a change. I mean, it was it was almost shocking to see, after all we had been watching and seeing, to see that image pop up. You think, wow, we're in a whole different place right now.
Whole different place. And, Christ was older. He was bearded, older meaning between 20 and 30 probably, and bearded. And he had a halo, which was the big distinction. He was looked at as divine, and he was divine at that point. So we are starting today with Constantine. And I want to the art of Constantine is really questionable. This is one of the most confusing elements of antiquity, this Arch of Constantine. And you can see that it was built in 3 years, from 312 to 315. The Senate gave it to Constantine, built it in honor of him for his defeat of Maxentius at the Milvian Bridge battle in 312. And this is significant because this was the point of Constantine's conversion. He saw in a dream a cross in the sky with the first letters of Christ's name, Cairo, in the sky beside the cross. And he of course knew about Christianity. Supposedly, his history says that in 300, 1/3 of Rome was Christian. And we know there were lots of Christians. We know there were lots of persecutions up to this point. Before Constantine's conversion, there was the massive 2-year persecution of Christians under Diocletian, which was apparently the largest mass execution. But in looking at this monument, we're going to see two different periods of art and two different styles. So I want to explain it to you because it is important in where we're going. The very top, these standing figures are from a monument of Trajan's. And Trajan was probably other than Julius Caesar, gained the most land, the most territory for the Roman Empire. And one of the countries or tribes that he conquered were the Dacians. And this is basically the Romanian area. And these figures are 10 feet tall. They are the Romanian captured soldiers who obviously became slaves to the Romans. And they're bearded and they have a different dress than the Romans, and we know that they're Dacians. The panels beside here are from a monument of Marcus Aurelius, and they were appropriated for this monument of Constantine. And the roundels are from a monument of Trajan. So all of these three carvings, which are high relief, typically classical carvings, and we'll see some details in a minute, are appropriations, and they're called spolia, and they are literally stolen, like the hide off an animal. That's where the word comes from other monuments and placed here. And probably this has something to do with how this got done in 3 years, by not carving these, but stealing them. The only historical time, meaning the time of this time period of Constantine carvings, are these small friezes that run around the sides of the arch. And they are from the time of Constantine, and they start with the march into Verona, the capture of Verona, the return to Rome, a big parade, and then Constantine giving money, largesse, to the people, and then the one speaking to his Senate, which we'll look at in detail. A completely different style by the time this monument's done. But we'll look at some details here for a minute. You can
I have a question. The kind of consolidating of these images, was that a way of of showing a
Uh,
continuation of Roman honor, or was
it
it
was.
co-opted?
It was two different things. Constantine wanted to be associated with the good emperors, and these three, even though they all persecuted Christians, were considered good emperors, meaning benevolent. They also kept the barbarians out of Rome.
Got it.
And not that this Pax Romana of Augustus Caesar, it had ended, but they were really worshipped by the Romans. So he wanted to be associated with them. And remember, his entire, or most of his Senate probably is pagan. So this was, in a way, to do it quickly, to honor these previous dictators or emperors, and also to associate himself with them. But it had to do with timing also, because early Christian art is really much more about timing than history, whether we're talking about religion or actual factual things going on here. So, but look at the beautiful proportions. I mean, these are smallish, deep relief figures on these panels that were removed and placed here. And I might add that in some of them, the faces of Hadrian, Trajan, and Marcus Aurelius were recarved to look like Constantine, and then at a later date, some were corrected. So
Okay.
you never really know exactly who you're looking at. Here is another close-up. You can see that this is really good of the Dacians. You can see their clothing, their wrapped heads, their beards. They're very rough, comparing them to how the Romans looked at this time. And this is interesting from the roundels from Hadrian's monument. This is a bear hunt, and only the aristocracy and the emperors were allowed to hunt. And this is a sacrifice of Hadrian to the goddess of hunt, Diana. Now, you might glance down and look at this. This is one of the historical pieces carved at the time of Constantine, done quickly compared to these. And check out these little puppet figures. So we're going to talk about that in a minute. Here's another angle of this, the rondelles. And this is from the northwest corner, and it actually is pretty well preserved. This is Constantine addressing the Senate and the people of Rome. And believe it or not, this is Constantine with his head missing. So vandalism certainly was everywhere in the Roman world, and not sure when his head was removed, but
Somebody didn't like him.
it was, and it was removed on another where he's giving the money to the Roman populace. So if we look at these carefully, there is some contrapposto, some weight shift in these. We also notice that they're very short. They're sort of puppet-like. They're maybe stand-in images for people. They seem very childlike, very almost silly, giggly, looking up in adoration, crammed together, and the back row doesn't even have a body. It's just a head. So this change in style, it's been very hard to explain. At first, historians thought that all the great artists had left Rome because of Rome is declining here. It's ruled by the Roman Empire has been broken into 4 different generals, 2 in the Western Empire, 2 in the East, Constantine's father being one. And so there was always a debate about, well, what happened to the great art? And yet over the years, historians have decided that this is more going back to the catacombs, symbolic. It's important. This is a stand-in for a historical event. a symbol of a historical event, not to be portraits of the people who were there, not even portraits of these two figures who were probably the rulers of the Eastern Empire at the time. And here is Constantine, who has already defeated Maxentius, who was the other ruler of the West. This is just an angle from the Colosseum and here's the frieze we're looking at. I'm moving now to Constantine the Great, and I want you to pay attention to his name, Constantine the Great. That gives us some clue as to his importance, his self-importance, his ego, his dominance, his power, monumentality over the Roman world. This is, as you can read, an 8-foot-6-inch head. It weighs 8 tons. It's part of a 40-foot seated sculpture of Constantine. And I'll talk more about that in just a minute, but I want to address his head, his appearance. So in general, looking at this, I think it's obvious that we're looking at two different things. We're looking at eyes that it probably grabs us first, and they tell us something different. They tell us that Constantine is engaged in more than likely some sort of spiritual or mystical experience. This could be a symbol reference back to his seeing the cross before the Milvian Bridge battle, which he gives credit to Christ for the success of the battle and the defeat and killing of Maxentius. And we also see a very Greek quality, a very Hellenistic quality, going back to Alexander the Great a little bit, even though this appears more like one of the Greek skull caps, athletic caps. And we also see this cleft chin, the sort of dimply, tight lips, a very strong jaw here, a Roman, what's called a hook nose, and definitely look at the muscles in the neck. We definitely see strength and power. We see a man in control of his country who is able to scare off demons and evil and aggressors. So there's a lot of symbolism here, and we really refer to this as abstract. If we think back to the first session on the temple figures at Abu Simbel of Abu and his consorts and the worshipers and their hollow eyes at that point. But what their eyes were telling us was that they were in communication with their God. And we really feel that here with Constantine. And that's been the analysis of this head. Just as a comparison, here's Hadrian. This is the general, the emperor of the Rondels that we just saw. And Hadrian, the Roman emperors go through different periods of adoration, and Hadrian wanted to be associated with Greek philosophers, so he adopts the beard. We see it in other emperors also. Some are clean shaven, some are not. And it's with Hadrian that we start to see the carving of the pupil and the iris. So there's significance here, and we look at Hadrian and we assume we are looking at a portrait. This is similar to the portrait of Julius Caesar, more similar to the portraits of Alexander the Great, where we can distinguish this man. We can see 10 portraits of him and say, that's Hadrian. So notice the comparison here, the difference, the exaggeration here in the eyes, in the power, and also references to antiquity, and that's important. Here are pieces, remnants of what is left of this enormous Colossus. There had not been a Colossus of a leader, an emperor, a ruler since Ramses II in Egypt. And this is significant. This is an elbow. This is a kneecap, right hand, 2 feet, various other pieces. I'm not sure. I think this is probably part of a leg, a shin bone. But you can see the proportions here. And this Palazzo de Conservatori, this is where all of these remnants or fragments of the sculpture are now. And they were found in various places in the Forum by Michelangelo, and he had them moved here in the High Renaissance period. So he obviously knew what they were. I mean, everybody knew what they were, but nobody cared. And we're going to look at some of the details. You can see the realism of these parts because they're distinguishable. These feet are calloused. Not everybody has a foot shaped like this with toes like this. And it's interesting, the core was, I might mention, brick and wood, and it was covered in bronze, and the limbs were marble. So there was quite a massive scaled figure here with
it was mixed media.
With powerful and rich elements and materials. And of course, it was destroyed, stolen, pieces of, the bronze melted down very early on in late antiquity, actually. And oddly enough, or interestingly enough, it had 2 right hands. The original right hand held a scepter, and the hand was recarved to hold an orb. The orb, of course, being symbolic not only of the universe, but of the heavens, and a very Christian element. We will see it a lot later on. The significance of this building is enormous. This was the Basilica of Maxentius, and it was not finished at the time of his death, and Constantine finished it. And it is a basilica in the Roman antiquity was really a government building, a hall of justice, various events and meetings took place there. But it had some significant architectural figures that we want to talk about. You notice these gigantic barrel vaulted arches. So this is, the Romans invented concrete, and their buildings have, from the Colosseum to almost everything they built from the 3rd century BC on, is concrete, or concrete and stone, or concrete and brick. So we want to notice the shape. We see it in the triumphal arches in the churches that we're going to look at. You see it all through this building. And it is a way of separating, a way of holding up a roof or a shape, obviously. And this continuous shape here, this very long room inside, was called the nave. And we see that in our world today. It stayed with us. So right here was the apse. And this is the ruin as you would see it today, by the way. Here's a floor plan of what you just looked at. We didn't have a view of the porch, but this is what we would call the nave. These are side galleries or rooms at the time. This was held up by piers with columns in front. And here is our apse. This is where Constantine placed his gigantic Colossus. And this was a symbol. This building was not a ruin at the time, of course. This was a symbol of his dominance, not only over the Roman Empire, but over Maxentius. So this is really called the Basilica of Constantine and Maxentius, but you'll see it a lot now just as the Basilica of Constantine, but you really need to remember the history of it. So we're going to move to really Constantine's greatest gift was his churches. And way before the Edict of Milan, before the legalization of Christianity, he started building churches. The first one was St. Peter's. It's now called Old St. Peter's in the city of Rome. And it's interesting. First thing I want to mention, which is unusual, it looks like we're looking at it, given our north, south, east, west orientation, it looks like we're looking at an apse on the east, but the apse was on the west. So this should really be flipped. The reason was because when it was built, the architects, the builders wanted, or Constantine wanted the approach to be from the city of Rome. And so they had to make Rome is over here. And so they had to, the apse ended up on the west side. And you see this occasionally where churches, because of geographical restrictions, have to be turned the opposite way. So just keep that in mind. It's built on, this is an atrium, the old center of open area courtyard of a Roman house going back to the Etruscans, and built in front of the cathedral, or the basilica, I should say. And we see a 5-aisled basilica here, the main nave, 2 side aisles on each side. And this would be your, this is your narthex, your entrance, your sort of foyer, if you want to call it that. And this would be your transept, which is your crossing. And this is the plan that eventually became the Latin cross that almost all of our nave style churches are built on now, where the transept was actually moved down a little so that the apse and the altar became a larger space. This is the site of the tomb of St. Peter. So this was built over St. Peter's grave, and we go back to Matthew to the St. Peter being the rock of the church, the order of Christ, and the honoring of that by Constantine. These are columns, all of these dots. And an interesting thing, talking about spolia, is Constantine had 8 of the spiral columns from the Temple of Solomon brought into this church. No telling where they are now, but they were here when the church was built. In the Roman world, things were destroyed, things were moved, they were used repeatedly, moved from one historical site to another. So looking a little more at this church and comparing it to its importance is enormous in the Christian world. Here is a typical Latin cross church. Now at Trinity, our transept is more up here and our back wall is straight, not curved. Typically the apse is curved. These are side chapels. This is just a general plan, not a specific church, but we see the narthex, the nave, the side aisles, the ambulatory going around through the apse, and the side chapels or back chapels. And look at the comparison here of the Church of St. Peter, the Basilica of St. Peter. This is the plan, or how it looked. Now, this is from an old drawing or sketch. By the way, this church was in existence until 1544, when the Pope decided that it wasn't large enough. It held between 3,000 and 4,000 people, depending on how many people were in the gallery. And I'm going to explain that in a minute. But he decided it needed to be rebuilt. So when it was rebuilt, the grave, they actually found a 2nd century grave that they believe was the body of the grave of St. Peter. And of course, this is where the baldacchino is in the current St. Peter's. But it lasted a long time, which is wonderful. But obviously there's nothing left for us to see other than some old drawings and etchings. So this was the plan. This was how it looked in 400. It was made of brick and wood for the most part, other than the columns, some stone in the front. And these were gates that you entered. The tower was later, probably in this 5th, 6th, 7th century. And here's your atrium, colonnaded atrium. And this is a three stories. Your first story was your ground floor. Then it's what's called the gallery. And the gallery was for women. And then you had your clerestory. This would be the gallery, and this would be the clerestory to let in light. And your columned aisles. A little more detail here. You can see a little more of the building, the timbered and trussed ceiling. This would have been wood. And your apse is not, as they say, not really visible here because of the transept. But you can see how light got in. There were a lot of amazing considerations here. And you know, spinning off of Greek and Roman temples, you weren't allowed inside. The interior was for the cult figure, Jupiter, Venus, Minerva, Athena, whoever it was. And you basically walked around the temple and your sacrifices were made outside. So this importance in the nave, this long stretch, is for the mass, for the viewing of the priest who is conducting the mass and who is recreating the Eucharist. And you see here this triumphal arch. This is your barrel vault that we saw in the Basilica of Constantine. Your side aisles. This would be your gallery. There would have been a floor here. And this is your second floor gallery and your clerestory, which continues all the way to our churches. Now their stained glass windows can be considered the clerestory. And then your gabled and trussed ceiling. Here's a more interesting detailed Grimaldi's. This is a famous drawing of, and this is after, this date is after the destruction, but based on this one. This is an etching from the apse mosaic that some of the mosaics were moved to various museums. The Vatican Museum has some when the original St. Peter's was destroyed, demolished, and but this was an old etching done in the mid-Renaissance period of what would have been on that back wall. Christ with Peter and Paul. We continue to recognize Paul as Paul, Peter with a beard. Kind of the standard. And we see the various stories of the lambs, the 12 sheep, the continuation of the symbolism for the Christians. And this is another etching from around that period. You can see how St. Peter's by the Renaissance got built out, churches surrounding it, the city of Rome filling in. These are various chapels. Saints and popes wanted to be buried here, and there were just constant graves and chapels added to have a place for the placement of the relics of those martyrs and saints. So it becomes really an enormous compound, but the seating never changes. This particular basilica shape never enlarges. We're going now to two other buildings built by Constantine, two other sacred buildings. This one, the Santa Costanza, is actually a mausoleum, but what it does is it provides us with a different plan for a church, which is a central plan. And if you look at this church, you can probably get more of a feeling of what the exterior of St. Peter's probably looked like. This is brick and stone and unadorned. The exteriors were not adorned with any kind of sculpture. They were meant to be plain and for the glory of God to appear once you walk through the door. And this is symbolic of the early Christian, plain on the outside, filled with the Spirit inside. And we can see here that this is a domed, a circular dome. We can see a clerestory, windows shedding light in it. And when I flip to the next slide, you're going to go, wow. Oh, no, it's the next one after this. I'll show you this cross section and floor plan first and explain a little. So here's what we're looking at. Same view we just had with your dome, your clerestory, and your main floor. And this is your floor plan. When we go inside, you can see this is circular. When we go inside, you're going to see 12 pairs of columns. And these columns were also spolia. They were taken from other Roman monuments. They're Corinthian and obviously symbolic of the 12 apostles. In a central plan church, we see the Greek cross. We cross here and we cross here, equal arms of the church. So your central plan is a Greek cross. This would be your narthex, your entrance right here. And this is called an ambulatory. It's the walking area around the central dome. And this, as I said earlier, Santa Costanza was Santa Constantina, who was the eldest daughter of Constantine with his second wife, Fausta. This is your interior, which is just glorious. If you look at those marble columns, the Corinthian capitals, the clerestory, the light that's shed, and this is your ambulatory walking around this.
It really spotlights where the altar is, all the light kind of just
Yeah,
flooding.
just this flooding of this glorious light. And these central plan churches were, of course, not always mausoleums. Santa Constantina was buried here. She died in 354 of a high fever. And but her body, her sarcophagus is now in the Vatican Museum. But it's a beautiful and significant building, and really gives us this floor plan, which you'll see again. And I might mention that I believe the All Souls Cathedral is a central plan church, and we'll see more the pattern of it where the Greek arms go out a little later.
Yep, you're exactly right.
So here is another view, a little more light shed in here. Really gorgeous. And we're moving now to this was the church, the monument to Christ that Constantine considered his most glorious and best. And he told his builders, his architects, he said, make this the crown jewel of Christianity. And we can't really witness that because all we have of the original is this drawing. I'm not sure when this was done, but this church was first destroyed by the Persians in the 7th century, or destroyed somewhat. The original basilica, as you can see here, very similar to the plan of Constantine's St. Peter's. And this is the rotunda of the Anastasis, which is the Greek word for resurrection. And this would have been where Christ's tomb was. And down here, the Rock of Calvary, and then also where St. Helena found the true cross. And I'll show you a little more of that in a minute. But this Constantine considered St. Peter's his second best, and this was his first. And it's just too bad we don't have more of a record of it. This is the church now, and sort of a little bit of an underground plan of placement of things. The Rock of Calvary, the current church is in red, and then the place they believe was the tomb. And one of the interesting things about this is after the destruction of the temple in 70 by Titus, the Hadrian on this particular site in Jerusalem filled in a cave and built a tomb to Jupiter and Venus over the cave. And when Constantine was doing work, excavation for his original basilica, he found the cave and removed the dirt, tore down the temple to Jupiter and Venus. So there's there obviously was an attempt here by Hadrian to hide this element of Christianity, and of course Constantine and his mother, who is of great importance in the Christian church, to resurrect all of this, the original sites.
Yeah, if I'm not mistaken, she was the primary mover for all the pilgrimage sites, or many of the famous pilgrimage sites in the Holy Land, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes, and the two of them together are responsible for the Church of the Nativity in Bethlehem. Yes, and Constantine ordered her. That's what you read is order. He ordered her to find the true cross, and she found pieces of the true cross, and there are relics of it many places. And there is a chapel here to her, and I'll show you more of that in just a second. So here is the incredibly confusing floor plan of the current Church of the Holy Sepulchre. And I have to say that I am confused. I have not been there. You have.
Having been there, it kind of makes sense, because basically you have all of Christianity kind of gets a piece of this area. Everybody's kind of got their own little section almost, and when you're there, it's amazing to see, the Greek Orthodox with the Franciscan in their robes, all kind of doing their things in different ways. It's a fascinating melting pot of Christianity.
Well, I don't even know. I think you'd need a week to see it, because I mean, it's just chapel after chapel that have been added on. And then of course, all of these holy sites, the Rock of Calvary, the different tombs, and this chapel to St. Helen or St. Helena, and places where the cross was discovered, and chapel to Adam. I mean, it's endless. It would take a lot of time, I think. But when I show you, if you have not been there, this is the main entrance, which we see here. Mm-hmm. And this is, I'm just going to show you some exterior views, because it's a conglomeration of different periods of building and different styles of building. And I want to point out right here, this, I'm going to call it an emblem. We see this in a lot of Constantine's monuments. This, of course, this apse was not done during the time of Constantine, but this is the cross with the Chi Rho, and we'll see it again in the Byzantine period, and it appears this was what Constantine saw in the sky at the time of his conversion. One other sort of overview looking down on this. Beautiful.
It's kind of incredible to think back on the first 2 weeks and how dramatically and quickly the imagery and the proportions change. You go from kind of pastoral, comforting small scenes to these images of grandeur and power. I mean, it's just the changes is just almost like whiplash. So it just seems to happen so quickly.
Well, it's amazing how Constantine got things built. And they're, you know, not only built in Rome, but Jerusalem in the Holy Land. And it was a flash forward, definitely. And we haven't, and we're not going to look at the original interior mosaics and decorations of these buildings because they were not of this period. So I'm trying to stick, other than I have jumped and shown you this, so you could get some sense of what's there now. But I'm really trying to show you artwork or buildings from the period historically. So you can see the path, but you're absolutely right. It's mind-boggling that how fast everything happened. This is the wall on the stairway going to the chapel of St. Helena, where pilgrims have carved crosses, and really in honor of her finding the true cross. So I think this is just beautiful. It reminds me of the prayer wall, you know, at the old temple.
Very much so.
There. And I jumped ahead again because you got to see this from the Vatican, from St. Peter's Cathedral of St. Helena. And I do not know who did this. This would have been from the Baroque period, from the rebuilding of St. Peter's. Going back to the importance of this building, again, nave, apse, side aisles, narthex. We don't have a transept here, but it's really important to remember how this developed, and we really owe the Romans. So this is a miracle. This is going to be a little confusing. It is for me. This was built by Constantine's father. So the question is, was Constantine's father in 300, who was one of the two emperors of the Western Empire, was he Christian? Because there were many Christians, as we said, in Rome in the 300s. This building, you can see the apse, you can see a main floor gallery, no clerestory here. And here is the interior. There would have been a floor here and a gallery initially. This was built by Constantine as his palace church in Trier. And he, over the years, it's changed. It's never been destroyed though, which is just incredible. And we see here the obviously the timbered trussed roof of that would have been that is wood sill, the stone walls, the 2 stories, and this open basilica that approaches the nave, this long stretch that would have given great viewing for the conducting of the Mass, the presentation of the Eucharist. And one thing I wanted to mention too, going way back to Dura Europos and the baptismal font there. The early Christians celebrated the Eucharist and baptism, the only 2 sacraments that were really common in the early Christian period, but those 2 were extremely important. So when Christianity was legalized and the Eucharist was shared in the Mass, it was incredibly important that you be able to see the priest. So this openness of the interior space, and we know from our church, it's hard if you sit over past the side aisle to see the priest. It's important to sit in the center, although some people prefer that. Anyway.
Yeah, and you actually see that now with the way we have to arrange the nave with the COVID seating, you know, the center aisle is, you know, that's the prime seating now, and there's less of it.
Yeah, It's you have to, do you have to be a big donor or a Republican or Democrat?
No, definitely not. Definitely not. You just got to get there early enough.
Okay. So I want to mention that so here is Rome right here. We're going to talk about Ravenna soon, and Constantine in 330. Now, Constantine is ruler over the entire Roman Empire. He moves his capital to Byzantium. He renames it Constantine. So we're way over here in the Eastern Empire. And Constantinople, named after him, obviously, was the capital of the Eastern Empire and the Eastern Orthodox or Orthodox Church until the Ottoman Turks invaded and captured in 1453. So this has an enormous history. And this world, the Eastern Empire, was incredibly wealthy. The Roman Empire, the Western side, starts to fade, and we'll see that starting next week, the changes in the art, how the art moves, the capital moves from Rome to Ravenna, and the influence of the Greek. This was Greek speaking, and Greek, dominantly Greek in so many ways, particularly in the art and the influence from Crete. We'll see how that changes the early Christian art. And here is the Roman Empire again, divided east and west. And here's Constantinople, there's Rome, and right up here near south of Venice is Ravenna. Okay,
Wow.
that's my talk for today.
That is fantastic. Thank you so much. It's just such a fascinating moment of transformation. Just so much to think about and reflect about, because also the theology of the church is developing, and this is when the Nicene Creed kind of comes into effect right around this time too. So there's so much here that's rich and going on, and to see that reflected in the art and the architecture is just fantastic. Thank you so much, Jennine, for your time and your wisdom.
Oh, you're welcome.
All right, we'll
Thank
see y'all next week.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye.